Well, thank you, Jenny, for that very generous introduction. I was cringing a little at the word experienced beekeeper, so in the interest of transparency and full disclosure, I'm really a neophyte beekeeper, but I am an enthusiastic amateur at it. And it's an interesting thing for me to have come to this focus on the archaeology of an ancient history of beekeeping. And it came about through my wife, who actually is an experienced beekeeper, having gotten me interested in it. And because I have boundary issues, I couldn't keep that division between work and bees. And so I started thinking, how old is this stuff anyway? And that led me to what I thought of as a really great place, that sort of sweet spot when you discover something that's ubiquitous and is in fact so ubiquitous that its importance is unquestioned. And it's something that's completely pervasive in our lives, and yet we don't really think about it. So I just started getting interested in, there must be a history to this. And I very quickly realized that as ubiquitous as it is, the history of this extremely important economic and cultural phenomenon of beekeeping, for all its importance, it's very, very poorly understood. And it's poorly understood at many levels. Like any beekeeper will tell you that there are many things where we can observe that bees do these things, but we have no idea why. Same thing with bees and honey. So I started questioning my colleagues, and there were probably knowing eye rolls toward the ceiling among many of you about this, that I would ask my colleagues in philology and archaeology about, is there a lot of stuff about honey in Mesopotamia or in Egypt? And they'd say, oh, yeah, it's all over the place. It's everywhere. I'd say, great. Well, can you point me toward a good synthetic overview? That's because I'm intellectually lazy. And can you point me toward a good overview of the history of bees and beekeeping in Egypt? And they'd say, no, there really isn't anything on it. And so I came to realize that there is a huge amount to actually explore here, and astoundingly little is known. We've spent decades, almost a century, as archaeologists investigating the origins of agriculture, and yet this crucial element of agriculture, the pollination by bees, is very, very poorly known. So I really started to pursue it, and it's something that's really piqued my curiosity in significant ways. That bees are ubiquitous. They're everywhere once you start looking for them, both in our own modern culture and in ancient cultures as well. Here you can see a Greek coin from Ephesus, with a bee on it, and at the bottom left and at the upper right, you have a beautiful piece of Minoan gold jewelry from the island of Crete with two honeybees on it, and their modern counterparts. Bees are incredibly important. We think of them as the source of honey, and we may think of them as a source of beeswax, and if you're a runner, you may think of them as a source of bee pollen. If you're really into health stuff, you may think of them maybe as a source of propolis. But in fact, their value as pollinators is amazing. That it's a statistical fact that 1/3 of the world's food supply relies on bees as pollinators. So we really ought to know about these things, that our very survival depends on them, and now is, as many of you will know from the newspapers or the news, is quite threatened by phenomena like colony collapse syndrome. So in tonight's talk, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by giving a general overview of what bees are, how they work, some of the properties of honey, and you'll have to forgive me if I wax eloquent, but it really is amazing stuff. If I beeswax eloquent, but So I'd like to talk about what bees are, what honey is, and then from there I want to talk about beekeeping and beehives and how modern beekeeping works. And then I'd like to, with that as a base, I'd like to take us back chronologically and look at what the textual record tells us about ancient bees and beekeeping, and then what the archaeological record tells us about bees and beekeeping. And what you'll see is there is a ton of stuff that we don't know, but also a lot of really amazing similarities between the ancient world and our own. And that's another thread that I think is really worth emphasizing, and that is for all the changes that have taken place, there's certain basic technologies or approaches that are at least 4,500 years old, and we're still doing pretty much the same thing in the way we keep bees. So that's what I'd like to try and accomplish, and let me walk you through it. And start by just saying that honeybees are Apis mellifera, and they come in a couple of key forms. That the most important one is the queen bee, who is the sole egg layer in the hive. And you have to think of a beehive as a kind of a collectivity with a collective intelligence and a collective character, and that the individual bees are, you can almost think of them as cells in an organism, and that you really, it's as a collectivity that they have their tremendous power and energy, and they're able to do so much. So the queen is the one who makes it all happen, and she lays something like 2,000 eggs a day and will lay 1 million eggs over the course of her lifetime. And that's all the result of her maiden flight, which is the one time that she actually reproduces. What are those thousands of bees? Well, the vast majority of the bees in a hive, and there are about 50,000 bees in a mature beehive, the majority of them are worker bees that are females. And then there's a small number of 100 to 500 males, who are also known as drones. And they serve various functions, reproduction with the queen, and they also play a role as guards in the hive. But eventually they outlive their usefulness, and the worker bees then basically kick them out or kill them. So it's a jungle out there. Now, this may look to you like a bunch of tortillas hanging from a tree, but in fact, this is what a beehive looks like in the wild. Usually they'll be inside a hollow tree trunk or something like that, but they also sometimes just hang from tree branches. So in their natural form, they're round. And that's an important point that we'll get to in a bit. And you can see this enormous swarm of bees. And if you look at the top, you can see little bits and pieces of the honeycomb sticking out at the top. And on the right, you can see that honeycomb. So the yellow stuff is hexagonal cells of beeswax, which the bees make. And then the bees fill that with various things. Various products. So I love this picture. You can see a bee about to land on a flower, and its legs are just covered with pollen. So the pollination of plants is incidental to the fact that the bees are collecting pollen to bring back to their hive. Bees eat two forms of food. The bee pollen is the source of their protein, and the nectar or the honey is the source of their sugar and carbohydrates. So basically, whatever falls off the leg, or falls off the bee's knees, I should say, that's what pollinates the plants. And so you can think of bees as basically collecting or producing a number of products. First is they collect pollen from flowers. The second is they collect nectar, the liquid from the inside of the flower, and that's what they bring back and turn into honey. They produce from the pollen and the nectar, they produce beeswax, which is what they use to construct honeycomb. And then one of the neatest things they do, all this is chemical conversion of different vegetable materials, chemically converted inside the bee's digestive tracts. They collect natural saps and resins and convert it into this amazing substance called propolis, which has extremely powerful antibacterial, antimicrobial properties, and it's like super glue. So they'll basically line the whole inside of the beehive with propolis to seal themselves off against microbes, fungus, and other kinds of unwelcome microorganisms. And propolis is so powerful that there's a bee research center in Minnesota that's actually looking at the value of propolis in HIV treatment. It's very, very useful stuff. But of course, the thing that we think of and identify most closely with bees is honey. And honey is really a remarkable substance. And I'm showing you this because to give you an idea of the amount of effort that it takes to produce honey, that it requires for 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds of honey, it requires 20,000 worker bees. They have to visit 4 million flowers, and by flying back and forth, bees will range up to 8 kilometers from their hive to collect nectar. They fly a total of about 180,000 kilometers. And one bee, in its whole lifetime, produces 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. So you really need those 50,000 bees in the hive to do this. And in a year, a good hive will produce roughly 50 kilograms of honey. And you can imagine how many graduate students had to figure out these numbers. But it's really a remarkable and kind of awe-inspiring feat of nature to produce honey. And the honey is produced they collect nectar, which has a very high water content, and then they basically desiccate it. So it goes from 90% water to less than 20%, about 17% water, and then it's honey. The honey is deposited in the honeycomb, and then they seal it off with beeswax. They cap the honeycomb and preserve it that way. And honey has medically demonstrated medicinal properties. It's used in burn treatment. It's antimicrobial, antibacterial, and has very strong preservative properties. And the reason it does that is because honey is what you would call hygroscopic. That means it absorbs moisture. So in burn treatment, you can see how valuable that would be, that most of the infections thrive in a moist atmosphere. So by bathing a burn wound in honey, you're keeping it safe and really accelerating the healing process. Honey also has the highest concentration of sugar of any product found in nature, and it's a great balance of about 50% glucose, 50% fructose. And unsurprisingly, it was the earliest and most widely used sweetener by ancient cultures. And the only thing that comes close to honey, I think, is dates, which are very, very high in sugar as well, but they don't come close to honey. So, bees are fascinating, and some people are more fascinated by bees than others. And I'm really not making this up, but this kind of, I'll call it extreme beekeeping, is very popular in China, and they actually have contests of who can get the most bees to land on them. And there's a very happy couple next to their beehives, and I'm showing this to you. These are pictures, the ones on the right are from National Geographic, the one on the left is from China Daily. Basically, the guy took a bunch of queen bees and put them on himself, and that attracted all the worker bees, and he was able to get more than 460,000 bees. And no one counted that. They just weighed him before and then weighed him once he was covered with bees. But you know, I'm not going to go that far as much as I love bees. So what does a modern beehive look like? A modern beehive is called the Langstroth hive, and it's a series of boxes. So starting at the bottom, you can see the entrance where the bees enter and leave the hive. And then I hope you can see these two very large, deep boxes. And those are called the brood boxes. That's where the queen lays her eggs, and they store honey and pollen that nourishes the bees while they're larvae as they grow to maturation. And then on top of that are honey boxes, or what we call supers, and that's where the extra honey gets deposited. So the job of the beekeeper is to encourage the bees to reproduce like crazy, and they have to make lots of honey to feed the bees. And then you say, oh, here's a nice empty box for you. And then they produce honey, and they fill it up with honeycomb, capped off with, and then you say, oh, here's another box. And you can get up to 3 or 4 boxes on top. And then at the end of the season, you steal the honey from them, and you leave them just enough to get through the winter. So that's probably what you would think of as a beehive when you look at it, when you think about it. And what's in those boxes are frames. So each box will have 10 of these frames in it with a plastic foundation on it, and the bees will build the honeycomb on that plastic foundation. So each box has 10 of those things. A honey super the frames will be a little smaller. And you can basically raise bees anywhere. My wife and I have one beehive at our house, and we found it's a highly effective home security system. And but when you have larger numbers of bees, you keep them out in a field somewhere where they're much happier, and they have access to much more food. So this beehive is called the Langstroth hive. It was named for a man named Alonzo Langstroth, who lived in Philadelphia, and he basically figured out basic aspects of bee behavior, like how closely you could space those frames so that the bees would be happy and produce the maximum amount of honey, and this idea of slotting in the frames so you can put in and take out, so making it very easy to harvest large amounts of honey on an industrial scale. So the Langstroth hive is basically very widely used throughout the world. But what's important to remember is that, in fact, it's a new invention, really only in the last 150, 160 years. Before that, the beehives that we think of, like on the state emblem of Utah, is this kind of oval dome-shaped hive made out of woven wicker, and it's called a skep, S-K-E-P. And that is the most common form of beehive in Northern Europe, certainly from medieval times onward, and probably much earlier. And I couldn't resist showing you this engraving by Peter Bruegel the Elder, because I think it's fantastic. It's very ghostly, and you can see these guys in the 16th century in their bee suits where they're wearing these wicker face protectors so the bees don't sting them, and they're collecting the honey, and you get this kind of otherworldly sense from it. It's a really beautiful print. And you can also see the bees clustered around the outside of the opening of the hive. And in the bottom left, you can see what does it look like inside. And all that stuff on the inside that looks like loaves of bread, that's honeycomb filled with honey. And then on the bottom right is a beekeeper in southern France with a whole enclosure filled with those traditional skep hives. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that what we think of as a normal beehive is a new invention, and that in fact beehive architecture and design has evolved a lot over time. And for our own purposes, and a key part of what I want to talk to you about tonight is what does traditional beekeeping look like in the Middle East? And it looks totally different, and you wouldn't even recognize it really unless someone sort of explained it to you. But beehives in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean in the historic period are these long ceramic cylinders, usually sealed at one end with a hole in it, and the other end open with a lid on it. So the top is a picture of just a stack of hundreds of these ceramic tube beehives in Middle Egypt, and the exact same kind of hive in Israel and Palestine and in Oman as well. And you can basically look across the Middle East, and that's what you'll see. That's how bees are kept. I'm pointing this out to you because if, as an archaeologist, you were to dig up something like that, you'd say, oh, it's a drain pipe. Or if you only found part of it, you'd say, oh, it's a deep basin. Or you really wouldn't think this is a beehive, and yet that's exactly what these things are. And you have to train yourself to look at it. I would bet you that in the basement of the Oriental Institute, we have a lot of fragments of beehives, and we just have no idea what they are. We just think of them, if you only have a piece of the rim, you would think it's something completely different. And the beauty of it is that people are still making these ceramic beehives. This is a picture from an Arab village in the Galilee of a woman making a ceramic beehive. And because people in Iran always decorate things wonderfully, you can see how most of these beehives are very, very simple affairs. They don't need to be elaborate. They're just plain, undecorated ceramics. But in Iran, in the Qajar period, and I have to thank Tasha Vorderstrass for showing these to me, it's great. The Qajars would actually glaze and decorate their beehives. I mean, whether it was to keep the bees happy or the beekeepers happy or what. But you can see wonderful designs. And I just wanted to point out a couple of little things to you on this, that in this central one, it's a row of these ceramic beehives. Can you see that? And inside them, you have circular tortilla-shaped things. That's the honeycomb. This guy has pulled out one of the ceramic beehives, and he's reaching in and he's pulling out honeycomb. So that's one thing, and you can see there's the hole at the bottom of the lid of the beehive. These are all three are beehive lids. See how they all have that same hole at the bottom for the bees to get in and out? And then I love this one. Here's a guy on a horse, and he's rearing back, and you can see all these little dots all around him. And I'm not an art historian, but I'm pretty sure that this guy has just upset a bunch of honeybees, and that's what's depicted there. So this is a very widespread, very interesting technology, and I want to show you it's actually a very ancient technology as well. All right, so you have bees, they make honeycomb, they fill it with honey, and then human beings collect that honey. And how do they do that? Well, one of the key things that is used is smoke. And what you see on the left, the upper left, is a beehive smoker. And you can see in these two pictures, the beekeeper is basically using the bellows to pump smoke into the beehive. And this is one of those mysteries we don't really understand. Some people say, oh, it calms the bees. And that's nonsense. It scares the willies out of them, and they're convinced that there's a forest fire. So they're just hunkering down, hoping to God to survive. And that's just fine with us as beekeepers, because then you can lift the frames out of the hive and brush the bees off them and take the honey away. So smoke is a key element in beekeeping, and as we'll see, it's a very ancient technology. So this is what one of the frames looks like when you pull it out of the those honey supers, the small boxes on top of the hive. And what you can see is that whitish stuff is the capping. That's the beeswax caps that seal off the honeycomb and keep the honey dry. As long as the honey is dry, it'll keep almost forever. Once it gets wet, it starts to ferment, and that's a whole other wonderful story that brings us to mead, but we'll get there. So basically, you collect these frames. Each frame has about 3.5 pounds of honey on it. 10 frames in a box, 35 pounds, 3 supers, so it's about a little over 100 pounds. If you're really good, you'd collect way more honey than that. So you bring the frames back to the honey house, and here we're using an electric knife to cut the capping off of the beeswax, and you can see this just trove of honey underneath that's released once you cut the capping off. And then you put it into this, which this is called an extractor. It's really a centrifuge. And with the deal with Iran, they no longer have these centrifuges. Remember, that's another kind of centrifuge. But basically, you put the combs in that have had the honey, the capping cut off them, and they start spinning. You can see there's a motor on top of the extractor. It spins around. There's a tapping of exit point at the bottom, and the honey flows out. And you filter it through a very fine screen, and you try and do this with no heat at all, because if you heat the honey up, you'll lose some of the aromatic properties of it, and some of the medicinal properties of the honey will also be lost. So you really, like if you think of olive oil, cold-pressed virgin olive oil, it's the same principle. If you heat the oil, it's not nearly as good. So that's just a picture of filtering the honey through a very, very fine screen. And that's so when you get your honey, there aren't those little pesky legs and heads of bees in it, which I think drives down the price. Now, one of the many things that's so fascinating about honey is, remember, it's made by bees collecting nectar from flowering plants, and then chemically processing it in their digestive system, and then desiccating it by flapping their wings over it to drive the moisture off it. So it's been said that honey, even more than wine, is a reflection of place, and that's absolutely true. So the chemistry of the soil and the water chemistry will affect the honey, and the different plants. Different plants produce very different kinds of honey. It tastes different, has different colors, and it has different properties as well. On the bottom right is a bee pollinating a tupelo plant. There's raspberries. All of these goldenrod, which, we hate it because of allergies, but in fact, goldenrod produces some really good honey. Grapevines and clover. So all of them will produce honey that tastes quite different. And you've probably experienced that if you've had clover honey and then orange blossom honey. And I love this. This is a set of different kinds of honey, and you can really see how, first of all, honey changes its color over the course of the season. Early season honey is a beautiful light golden color. And then over the course of the season, the honey gets darker and darker as the plants are maturing and as later blooming plants become the source of the nectar that's collected. And the darkest honey comes from buckwheat and tupelo, and it has this kind of molasses-like consistency, and it's very, very strong. I mean, you might think of it as like a porter ale or something really, really strong, or something like that, whereas the raspberry and apple blossom is much, much lighter. And the best honey I've ever had is from an early spring linden honey. So it's really fascinating. You can see the tremendous diversity in taste and characteristics of the honey. And I mentioned that honey reflects the properties of the plants that it's collected from. And the best example of this comes from Turkey, where there's this stuff called deli bal, which means crazy honey in Turkish. It comes from the Black Sea coast of Turkey, where the rhododendron ponticum plant grows. And rhododendron ponticum contains this compound called gryanotoxin, and it's a hallucinogen. So I love this thing from a Turkish newspaper that says, "Crazy honey, is it a medicine or is it poison? It can even be used as a chemical weapon." And so, I like how your minds work. And anyway, for those of you who are pre-meds, this is the structure of gryanotoxin, which is in deli bal. So you might think, oh, this is just folklore, or just some kind of stupid legend that they tell tourists. It's a pharmacological fact that deli bal contains this gryanotoxin. It's a pharmacological fact that it is a hallucinogen, and it's a historical fact. We can actually read descriptions of this, and I love this. And this comes from Xenophon's Anabasis, The March Up Country. Most of you probably know the story of Xenophon and his 10,000 Greek mercenaries who participated in an abortive attempt to put a pretender onto the throne of Persia in about 400 BC, and things went south really fast. And so Xenophon and his army had to head north to get out of Mesopotamia. And so they did what's one of the greatest military accomplishments in recorded history, that they marched and fought their way across 3,400 kilometers all the way across Mesopotamia, Kurdistan, Armenia, and the Anatolian plateau, and they finally reached the Black Sea and were able to be rescued. Well, why am I telling you this? Because as they were fighting their way through, they came upon a village on the Black Sea coast, and outside the village were all these beehives. So, of course, being soldiers, they immediately just jumped on these things and grabbed all the honey they could get. And this is what Xenophon says: all the soldiers who ate of the honeycomb lost their senses, seized with vomiting and purging, none of them being able to stand on their legs. Those who ate but a little were like men very drunk, and those who ate much were like madmen, and some like dying persons. In this conditions, great numbers lay on the ground as if there had been a defeat. The next day, none of them died. They recovered their senses about the same hour as they were seized. And the third and fourth day, they go up as if they'd just taken a strong potion. He's exactly describing Delhi Baal. There's no doubt about it. So we know, we have historical documentation from 400 BC that Delhi Baal was in use. Now, bees were very widely used throughout the ancient world, and Virgil talks about them in his very great poem, The Georgics. And the bees are a kind of a metaphor for an ordered society where everyone knows their place, and for industriousness. And we still associate those characteristics. It's kind of anthropomorphizing, but we still think of bees in that way. And Virgil talks about how some are gathering food, some are collecting pollen, some are collecting nectar, and some are making honeycomb in the hive, and some are making honey, and some are guarding the gates of the hive. But look at the bottom part. You have this wonderful Roman oil lamp with a bee on it, and Virgil talks about if you want to unseal their noble home and the honey they keep in store, first bathe the entrance, moistening it with a draught of water, and then follow it with smoke held out in your hand. So the Romans were doing exactly the same thing that beekeepers do today. They were smoking the bees to basically make them back off so they could take the honey. So it's a remarkable kind of thing. This is, 2,000 years ago. Now, the history of beekeeping goes way, way further than that. All right? So you have to think that humans have known about honey for millennia and started off as gatherers of wild honey. So they were basically hunting and gathering honey in the forest. But at a certain point, and that's one of the questions that we still don't really understand, they domesticated bees and they moved from honey gathering to beekeeping, where they were keeping bees in hives and collecting from them. So the uses of honey in the ancient Near East were for food as a sweetener. Alcoholic beverages like mead or honey wine was used very importantly in medicine and in ritual. It was a very important preservative, and it's a really central thing in literature and religion as a cultural metaphor for sweetness and goodness and love. And we see all of those things in the Bible, where it talks about how the Lord's ordinances are sweeter than honey, and the rules of the Lord are true, and they're sweeter than honey in the drippings of the honeycomb. And of course, the whole metaphor of God leading the Israelites out of Egypt and leading them to a land of milk and honey. In Egypt, this pains me as a Mesopotamian specialist, but I have to admit that, okay, the Egyptians domesticated bees. way before the Mesopotamians did. All right, there, I've said it. And the bee was very, very important in Egyptian culture, and it was one of the metaphors in royal titulature for the pharaoh, who was referred to as he of the sedge and the bee, where the bee was the symbol of Lower Egypt, and the sedge, or bulrush, was the symbol of Upper Egypt. It's very pervasive in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian medicine. And in fact, when you look at it, in both my Egyptological and Mesopotamian Assyriological colleagues have said it's the most frequently listed ingredient in any medicine from both Egypt and Mesopotamia. And they used it both externally as a salve or things like that to treat wounds and sores and infections and eye problems, and also internally to treat the lower intestinal tract. And it was also used to sweeten other bitter medicines. And here are some recipes for various cures in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. Now, I mentioned that honey has antibacterial properties, and this is, again, something that's been determined experimentally, where they've done experiments with Staphylococcus bacteria and also with E. coli, and they've been able to show that basically if you put honey on those bacteria, it kills them within 3 days. It's very, very powerful, strong, effective medicine. So when the Egyptians and Mesopotamians were using honey as a salve, they knew exactly what they were doing. And they even had the proportions worked out exactly right. So about 1/3 honey in a salve is thick enough to do the trick, and not so much that it would just be goopy all over the place. And honey is also a highly effective preservative because of, as I mentioned, its moisture-absorbing hygroscopic properties. And I found this picture, and I couldn't resist inflicting it on you. It's a picture of modern honey and then 2,500-year-old honey from a tomb in Paestum, Italy. And the honey is still completely recognizable as honey. As long as you keep it dry, it'll pretty much keep forever. And the bees use honey and propolis as a mummifier. Like if a mouse is dumb enough to make its way into a beehive, the bees just swarm on it and they cover it with honey and propolis and they basically mummify it. So that's what you're seeing. That's what that unfortunate mouse is. But my favorite candidate for honey mummification is Alexander the Great. That apparently he requested or ordered on his deathbed that he be mummified in honey. And they put him in this giant, what do we even call it, giant sarcophagus on wheels, and it was being transported, and the generally held historical belief is that Ptolemy hijacked Alexander's mummified body in honey and brought it to Egypt to legitimize his rule over the country. Beekeeping is very ancient in Anatolia as well. We have Hittite laws from the 14th, 13th century BC with very severe punishments for thieves of bee swarms and beehives. The severity of the punishment tells you that the bees were very valuable, and it also tells you people were probably doing it a lot if they had severe penalties for them. It's very common, widespread vocabulary, and of course Hittite is an Indo-European language, so the word sweet is milit, and think of mel is the word for honey in Latin, melissa. So it's very pervasive in Hittite Anatolian culture. Now, Mesopotamia, as I said, did not have a tradition of beekeeping. They had a long tradition of honey use, but not of beekeeping, at least not that we know from the textual record. And some of the earliest references that we have is from the Neo-Assyrian period, when the governor of North Syria, or actually South Syria, the land of Mari, he brags that he brought bees that collect honey, and which from the time of my fathers and forefathers no one had seen nor brought to the land of Suhu. I brought it down from the mountains of the Habha people, that's probably Anatolia, and I settled them in the gardens of the town of Al-Gabaribani. They collect honey and wax. I am proficient in the cooking of honey. He shouldn't have heated it, by the way, and wax, and so are the gardeners. So the point I want to make here is he imported bees over a very long distance out of the mountains of Anatolia and established colonies in Syria. So that's what the textual record tells us. The archaeological record also corroborates this story. We have very ancient cave paintings from Spain from 6000 BC that show a hunter-gatherer climbing a tree, and he's gathering honey out of the hive that's inside that knothole in the tree. And then from about 1,000 or 2,000 years later, you have guys climbing up ladders to steal honey out of hives in a tree. And then I couldn't resist this. This is a book engraving from Germany in the 18th century, and they're essentially collecting wild honey in the exact same way. But here's the thing. Our earliest archaeological evidence for beekeeping comes from the Old Kingdom, from the 5th dynasty, from the Sun Temple of Nausere. And what you can see, if you look, is those cylindrical hives stacked up and a guy pulling honeycomb out of them. Then they're storing it in jars and pouring honey into storage jars. So it's absolutely unambiguous. But you have to know that that's what beehives look like. And if you didn't know that, it would be really kind of confusing. And then we found archaeological evidence, and for my Egyptological colleagues, there's a mistake here. I called it Middle Kingdom, and of course the 13th century is the New Kingdom, so please forgive me, I'm a prehistorian. But we actually have, from Cahun, we have one of those ceramic beehives with the hole, and there were actually remains of bee parts inside the beehive. And then this is perhaps one of the most beautiful examples from the New Kingdom tomb of Rekhmire, and you can see those ceramic beehives lying on their side, closed at one end, open at the other. The guy's pulling out honeycomb. You can actually see a honeybee in the painting. It's really cool. And then this is the part I wanted to point out. The guy's holding a bowl, and those are plumes of smoke coming out of it. So in 2400 BC, they're already using smoke to collect the honey. You still see these ceramic beehives in the late period, around 650 BC, from the tomb of Pabasa. Okay, the bees are not exactly to scale. They'd be very cramped in those accommodations. But you can see it's the exact same beehive technology. And then I wanted to thank my colleague Brian Hughes for this one, that I've been trying to track down these Egyptian papyri from the Ptolemaic period that talk about unbelievable scale of beekeeping in Egypt in the Hellenistic Ptolemaic period. There's one papyrus that refers to just a single beekeeper having 5,000 beehives, and we can see these papyri talk about these guys moving massive numbers of beehives up and down the Nile on boats to go from field to field. And they're going from one nome into another nome, and they were so intensive in their production, they were getting 2 honey harvests per year. So this is not a backyard activity. This is industrial scale beekeeping. And we also see evidence, archaeological evidence, for honey in Anatolia in the Iron Age. This is the tomb chamber of King Midas at Gordian in Turkey. And what we have is drinking vessels, and what are they making? They're making mead. And mead is, of course, honey wine, and one of the wonderful things about mead is it has these two polar opposite cultural connotations. On the one hand, there's that whole Viking connection, and on the other hand, there's the idea of the honeymoon. So my big idea for marketing is to try and reach both markets, and I'd have one sort of, the gentler brand of mead that I'd call Melissa, and then the other one that I'd call Berserker. But please don't steal that idea. Okay, an archaeometry specialist named Pat McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania has done geochemical gas chromatography studies of the contents of these giant cauldrons and raita found inside the tomb of King Midas at Gordian, and he found clear evidence that what they have there is a fermented mixture of mead, beer, and wine, and I would argue for my colleague Mike Fisher that this is the world's earliest known cocktail. But this is perhaps the most impressive evidence of ancient beekeeping, archaeological evidence, and it comes from Iron Age Tel Rehov in the Jordan River Valley, just a little bit south of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. Here's a view of Tel Rehov, and it's excavated by Amichai Mazar, and what they found is, can you see, it's row upon row of these ceramic beehives in situ. And they figured out that there are over 120 of them minimally. And you can see the removable lid, and you can see the hole where the bees would fly in and out. So that end is where you'd steal the honey from, and that end is where the bees would go in and out. So being archaeologists, they extracted the goop from those hives and sent it to entomologists to study. And they did scanning electron microscopy of the different bee parts. And then they did principal components analysis of the dimensions of the bee parts, and they were able to establish a very surprising conclusion that the bees at Tel Rehov were not the native Palestinian honeybee, but in fact, they fit exactly within the range of the Anatolian honeybee. Remember, the Neo-Assyrians were already bringing down bees from the mountains of Turkey. This is 200 years earlier. It's clear that Anatolian honeybees are more docile, and they produce 3 to 8 times as much honey as the Palestinian bees. So they would have been highly desirable. People were importing bees over about 1,000 kilometers out of the mountains of modern Turkey to northern Israel in the 9th century BC. And that's what we reconstruct the apiary, the industrial apiary would have looked like. And it's almost an exact analog to the thing that you see in the picture from villages in Middle Egypt today. So, all right, how do you put that together? I'm just going to guess, I'm just going to speculate. We have very spotty evidence. Our earliest documented proof of industrial domestication of bees and beekeeping and those ceramic hives comes from Egypt in the Old Kingdom, the later 3rd millennium BC. We have good evidence in the 2nd millennium that up in Anatolia they're keeping bees. Mesopotamia was a latecomer to it. And in the middle, we have very good evidence that bees were being imported from Anatolia into Syria and ancient Israel or Palestine. So what happened? Were there 2 separate hearths of domestication? It's very, very possible. But we don't know. No one's ever found ceramic beehives in Anatolia, but I'm sure they're there. So that's one of the mysteries that we really need to solve, is where does the history of domestication of bees, and no one has investigated that yet, and I think we ought to. So I want to end there and say that I wish I could have brought you free samples of honey, but I wasn't sure of the turnout tonight. But go home and enjoy some honey, and think of that one little bee producing 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in its entire life. And I hope what I've managed to do is to at least pique your curiosity about this thing that's pervasive in our lives and unquestioned. So I want to end by thanking my colleagues here at the OI who gave me tons of information and pointed me in really interesting directions. And I want to thank my wife Liz, who got me introduced to beekeeping, and it's a wonderful place to go. So thank you for your attention.